What does worship mean to you? How would you describe worship? Is it singing songs of praise? Or is it attending a service like we are doing? Is that the one time in the week when we worship God? Well, it is those things, but it's a whole lot more. It's a whole lot more. Worship is expressing our worship of God. It's in the everydayness of our daily lives. How do we live out our lives? In the light of the fact that we have professed Christ, we want to follow him and serve him. How do we live for Jesus? Because how we express our worth of God in our daily lives is how we truly worship. Because if God isn't worth much to us, then we won't be seeking to do much of what he asks us to do. How much is God worth to you? Expressing our love for God in the daily things of life. This is true worship. This is what Daniel shows us. Daniel lived a life of worship in a context that was totally alien to what he was used to, what he grew up with. Daniel is a wonderful example of how we live for Christ in a culture and a society, in an environment that just doesn't square with what we know God is calling us to do and be. That was my intro. On the 11th of September 2001, I was sitting at my desk in my vicarage in Chester, and I got a phone call from a member of the church. He said to me, "Have you seen what's going on in America?" I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "Go and look at the television. A plane has crashed into one of the Twin Towers in New York." I rushed to the television, turned it on, and I saw the events many of you seen and probably still recall now. And as I stood there watching, absolutely horrified, I thought to myself, the world has changed forever. The world is never going to be the same again after this. The world has turned upside down. And I give that as a thought because this is in a sense where Daniel was in his life with God. He was brought up to the temple. He was from nobility, as we read. He was being trained probably for a very high office, maybe for service in the temple. As far as they were concerned, God looked after Jerusalem. It was the place of his dwelling. He honored God by what he did and everything that happened in Jerusalem. It was the city of Zion. God would never fail it. And there he is, all of a sudden, in Babylon, in an alien country, a captive, turned out of his home, out of his city, out of his temple, surrounded by things that were alien to his whole way of thinking and living. He was struggling. Or was he? Let's see what he was going to be doing. The unthinkable had happened, as we've seen. The city is destroyed by a heathen empire. Everything that he planned for and thought about had gone. And the story of Daniel illustrates for us how we can live that life of worship, how we can live that life for God in our daily lives, in an environment which, let's be honest, is not always sympathetic with the Christian way of life. In fact, sometimes it's downright hostile to it. And I believe that is increasingly so. As people like the secular society and the atheist society are having increasing influence on the government and the way things think and happen in this country, we are faced with a challenge. How we continue to be faithful to God, live that life of worship in the context in which we find ourselves. As Christians, therefore, we've got three choices. One, we either go off into a little holy huddle somewhere and pretend that the world isn't changing. Or two, we give in to that change and absorb ourselves, allow ourselves to be absorbed into that culture. Or thirdly, which is what Daniel did, we discover God in the reality of where we are and learn how we adapt and how we live for God in the situation we find ourselves, both in society and in our daily lives. That's the choice facing us today. Living Christianly in a society that is becoming increasingly different from the kind of society that we would want to live in. More secular and less sympathetic to Christian values. How we live, to me, that is true worship. How we honor God by the way we live out our everydayness. And I would suggest the first is to go into some kind of religious ghetto that removes God from every part of our society. It puts them into some kind of holy compartment. And the second fails to exist fails to exist in the new situation which we find ourselves. And we end up compromising. And we see in some parts of the church, don't we, where we are giving in to the demands of society. That is not honoring God. The third is where we must be, where the gospel is to make an impact, where we're to speak with power and distinctiveness in the way we live out our lives. Whatever may be going on around us, whatever the culture offers us, wherever we are still within the activity of God. Let us never lose sight of that. We may be like Daniel in a place where we're not quite sure why we're here, how we got there. But God is still sovereign, as we will hear next week. God is still in the activity of our daily lives, no matter what the world tries to do with us. The book of Daniel is rich in material for understanding how we can be true to God and be distinctive when the society and the culture around us threatens to overwhelm us and absorb us into it. And the book of Daniel is a great book if you read it through. Some parts at the end are visions, a bit puzzling perhaps, but the book of Daniel features in the New Testament, especially in Revelation. It's a saga of culture clash, of political intrigue, of bravery, of wisdom, of working God's purposes out through it all. It is primarily the story of how some Hebrew people managed to live out their faith and be distinctive in a society that was trying to suck them in. And it's specifically the story of Daniel and his friends who have to lead the exile community through this new culture and help them to adapt. It's a story of how to react when life doesn't work out how we originally planned it. Now, Daniel, interestingly enough, is considered one of the great leaders of the Jewish people. But in fact, he was never a leader as such in that sense. He was never the one in charge, like David would have been. He was always subject to the emperor. And that may take comfort some of you who may not be leaders in your own daily life or environment, but it enables you to think about, well, if Daniel could take a stand for Jesus, if he could be distinctive in that kind of situation, how can God use me to be distinctive in my situation? Daniel influenced his society through what he had to do and doing it very well. He was a top administrator with exceptional visionary powers, and it seemed to be the combination of these things which attracted him to the emperor, because we see at the very end of that first chapter, don't we, that the emperor approved of these. He saw Daniel and his friends as being outstanding amongst all the people he had around him. We must be careful, though, of putting Daniel into some kind of easy life. He had far from an easy life. His life was messy and difficult. He had to go through trials. The path God laid out for him wasn't always easy. But it seems that his wisdom, which he relied on from God, got him through. That is what we need to do if we're to shape the world around us, if the life of worship is to be powerful in the way we live out our lives too. The situation that Daniel found himself was that the Jews all thought, as I said earlier, that Jerusalem was invincible. God would never allow anything to happen to Jerusalem. This is where he lived. We can behave how we like, because God will never do anything against us. But if you read the books of Kings and Chronicles at the end there, you see the story of what happened. And the Jews didn't realize at the time, but they soon did, that this was not just some kind of weak, inactive God who had allowed this. This was a deliberate act it was the will of God that brought this about. That needed some rethinking too. When you add up all that together, that God's people felt challenged in their faith. All the kind of things that they lived on, the basic assumptions of their personal lives, had all been swept away. And maybe that might be you today. Maybe things that you'd planned haven't worked out. Maybe you're not in the place where you would like to be. But God has brought you there. God is not inactive. He is not passive. He is working in your life. Being faithful to him is crucial. Think about the changes that have come about in our own society. The kind of values that I grew up with seem to have gone altogether. The framework that we had, the Christian framework, is not the same as it used to be. Truth now is anything you want truth to be. I once was on a mission in Cornwall, and I spoke to a young man on his door, and we talked about worship, about Jesus, and he said to me, "You can worship whenever you like. Come into my house." And I went into his lounge, and he had some strange idol figure on his mantelpiece. He said, "That's my God. If that's your God, fine, but that's my God, and I have the right to choose it." That seems to be the kind of thing we're in. Truth now is debatable. You can believe what you like, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. And it's staggering, it seems to me, how many people live for the big win. I was once asked to speak at a school in Chester to some students about things, and I could tell from a lot of them that they all did the lottery every week, and it felt so big for them. It was the main thing that drove their thinking and lives. How we can get more money, as if that is going to make everything work out fine. Having a good time and blow the future, that seems to be part of how we are today as well. The concept of wisdom that I inherited about church and community and about our place in the world with God seems to have gone. So what's all this got to do with me, and what's it got to do with church? Well, I'm trying to demonstrate that the world changed dramatically, just like Daniel's. And Daniel learned how to live out that life, offering worship to God through his daily decisions and choices. The way he lived out that life was how he lived for God. He couldn't have given up on God, could he? Because he knew that God was with him. And the challenge of us today is to live that life, to demonstrate and show that God is still there, that there is a God we can believe in, that we can trust. That the Bible has much to say about our place in the world and how we live out our lives. It's not an irrelevance. We have to take the essential gospel truths and live them out. We have to find ways of maybe adapting and thinking about how they speak into our new situation. There's always something in there to help us. Daniel had to learn that under the control of Nebuchadnezzar was not to be out of the control of God. In other words, our lives may take directions that we're not certain about or happy about, but it does not mean that God is not in control. If you choose to follow God and be faithful to him, he will never let you go. Next week will be 60 years since I went forward at a youth camp and asked Christ into my life. And I can tell you, the last 60 years have been incredible years of God's faithfulness throughout all kinds of trials and difficulties. Leaving a family business, going off to study at college with only 4 O-levels, finding the finance, coming into ministry with all the struggles that has, being diagnosed with cancer. In all these things, God is faithful. That is the good news. If you don't remember anything today else, but remember, God is faithful. He will be with you in all the contexts of where you are. Trust him. Stay with him. Daniel was confronted by a culture that was not fit with his faith, but he learned how to be faithful and true. That is true worship. That is worship in its full context, honoring God daily in our lives. We need to learn how to do that as we live out our lives. There will be times when the choices will be hard. Sometimes we have to confront things. Sometimes we'll be able to influence things. Sometimes we'll be able to enrich things. In our reading in chapter 1, we notice, don't we, that Daniel and his friends were given other names. They didn't seem to argue with that. But when it came to food, they put their foot down. No, that is one step too far. We're not going to do that. It may not be an issue today, but there will be something else that you will wrestle with. There will be other issues that will come. Daniel stood out to be different. And for us in our work and amongst our neighbors, we'll probably have to make prayerful decisions about how we respond to things, what is important and where we take a stand, and where we actually might just think, well, we don't need to quite be so firm on that one. That's not really an important issue. We see in the book, don't we, that Daniel lived in the court of a pagan king, stood by that king, served his empire, but who knows where to take a stand and honor his God by the things that he said and did. We too are challenged by our own willingness to accept our involvement in the world, but there will be points where we say, no, that is enough. I'm not going that way. In a sense, we're called to be citizens of two worlds, neither surrendering our citizenship of heaven by being sucked into our culture, nor surrendering by retreating into a religious ghetto. But you'll notice that Daniel doesn't do this on a basis that if he does what is right, he will be nice and comfortable. Far from it. He did it knowing that at some point it would get him into trouble. And we know, of course, from the lion's den story that it did. But later on, a refusal to bow down to the statue of the king got 3 of them thrown into a fiery furnace. Listen to what they said to the king when he threatened them with that. If you throw us into the furnace, the God we serve is able to rescue us. But even if he does not, then know, O king, that we will not serve your gods. The book opens all kinds of questions, therefore. How do we carry on believing in a God who lets things happen that we don't understand? How will we fare in a society that increasingly rejects Christian values and teaches our children false values? How can we take a stand for Christian principles in workplaces and communities? and convince others that they will not lose out as a consequence. And thinking of that some years ago, a friend of mine told me a story of how he was asked by his boss to fiddle a customer's account. He said to him, "I can't do that." The boss said to him, "Why is that?" He said, "Because I'm a Christian and I'm not prepared to do that." And when attacked by his boss, my friend replied that the company could have complete confidence in him because it now knew that if he was not prepared to fiddle one of his customers, he was not going to fiddle the company. His boss didn't quite know what to say to him. Daniel shows us it's possible to be obedient to God in a pagan workplace and indeed be successful at it. Daniel is exposed to alien wisdom, just like we are, but eventually he's able to show that God's wisdom is far superior. The book of Daniel teaches us there is more insight about life, about the world, about politics that only God gives. God is in connection with their destiny, even when it feels like the opposite is true. That he is the giver in connection with their abilities and their character, even under extreme pressure. And it's worth noting, as we saw at the end of that chapter, that when Nebuchadnezzar was just dust and Cyrus was in charge, Daniel was still there, leading that nation along with the new emperor. So Daniel offers no answer to the question, why has my world changed? Why is this happening to me? Why is it harder to live for Christ? But the fact that he stayed steadfast to the end shows that those who wait on God will never find him wanting. Their faith survives, and so will yours. We need to recognize that that kind of life is the offering of true worship to God. And we need to recognize that in a changing world, we need to learn how to live Christianly in that world and how we relate as a church to that world. Otherwise, we risk becoming a little blob on the edge of our society. Let us live for Christ wherever he puts us, using the gifts and the talents that he's given us, open to what God wants to give us and how we can show and be distinctive by touching the lives of others and showing that being a Christian is a great thing and it works. Shall we pray?